Before the world saw Leopold as a humanitarian, Belgium saw him as a restless king. His country was small, cautious, and deeply divided, not the kind to chase foreign dreams. So when Leopold began speaking about Africa, his ministers hesitated. They saw risk where he saw destiny. To calm them, he did what kings and businessmen often do. He wrote a letter that sounded holy and harmless. Dear Minister, I have never ceased to call the attention of my countrymen to the need to turn our view toward overseas lands. History teaches that countries with small territories have a moral and material interest in extending their influence beyond their narrow borders. Greece founded opulent cities, bastions of arts and civilization, on the shores of the Mediterranean. Later, Venice built its grandeur on its maritime and commercial relations, no less than on its political success. The Netherlands have 30 million subjects in the Indies who exchange tropical products for the products of the mother country. It is in serving the cause of humanity and progress that peoples of the second rank appear as useful members of the great family of nations. A manufacturing and commercial nation like ours, more than any other, must do its best to secure opportunities for all its workers, whether intellectual, capitalist, or manual. These patriotic preoccupations dominated my life. It is they that caused the creation of the African effort. My pains were not sterile. A young and vast state, led from Brussels, has peacefully taken its place in the sun, thanks to the kind support of the powers which have applauded its beginnings. Belgians administer it, while other compatriots, more numerous every day, are already making a profit on their capital. The immense river system of the Upper Congo opens the way for our efforts for rapid and economical ways of communication that will allow us to penetrate directly into the center of the African continent. The building of the railroad in the cataract area, assured from now on thanks to the recent vote of the legislature, will notably increase the ease of access. Under these conditions, a great future is reserved for the Congo, whose immense value will soon shine out to all eyes. Soon after that memorable act, I thought it my duty, when death will come to strike me, to make it easy for Belgium to profit from my work, as well as that of those who helped me to found and direct it, and to whom I give thanks here once again. I thus made, as sovereign of the Congo Free State, the will that I am sending you. I will request that you communicate it to the legislative chambers at what seems to you the most opportune moment. The beginning of enterprises such as those that have so preoccupied me is difficult and onerous. I insisted on bearing the charges. A king, to give service to his country, must not fear to conceive and pursue the realization of a project so adventurous in appearance. The riches of a sovereign consist of public prosperity. That alone can appear to his eyes as an enviable treasure, which he should try constantly to build up. Until the day of my death, I will continue with the same thoughts of national interest that have guided me until now, to direct and sustain our African efforts. But if, without waiting for that date, it makes sense for the country to contract closer ties with my Congo possessions, I would not hesitate to make them available to it. I would be happy, while I am alive, to see it in full benefit towards the chambers as towards the government for the aid that they gave to me on several occasions in this creation. I do not think I am mistaken in affirming that Belgium will gain genuine advantages and will see opening before her on a new continent, happy and wide perspectives. Believe me, dear Minister, your very devoted Leopold. In this letter, he promised that his African project was for science, for humanity, for God. He wrote that it would not cost the Belgian treasury a single coin, that he would fund it himself as a private citizen. He told them Belgium would gain honor, trade, and influence, all without bloodshed or burden. It was the perfect illusion, a king asking permission to do good. But every word was designed to hide intent. He was not seeking approval. He was securing silence. By promising the Parliament that his venture was personal, he removed their right to question it. And so, with one carefully written letter, Leopold freed himself from accountability. Belgium would later claim, "We did not know." But the truth is, they were told only what he wanted them to hear. The letter became a veil, the kind that covers not the face of virtue, but the face of deceit. And Allah, the subtle, saw how power disguises itself in politeness. Sometimes the most dangerous wars begin with gentle words. Europe has always kept two archives, one for the public and one for the powerful. In the first, kings look noble. In the second, they look human. When it comes to Leopold's letters with Queen Victoria and other monarchs, the second archive still sleeps behind locked doors. The records exist, tucked inside royal collections in Brussels and Windsor Castle, but access is restricted to those who understand the sensitivities of state. In plain language, that means only those who won't shake the image of Europe's saints. Historians who tried to see the letters describe endless barriers, sealed folders, denied requests, and polite excuses like, "The papers are undergoing preservation." But everyone knows what preservation really means: protecting the reputation of those who blessed the exploitation. These weren't just letters about trade or diplomacy. They were letters about complicity. They reveal a Europe that spoke one language in public, humanity, and another in private, profit. They reveal the hidden agreements that allowed a small European king to own a land the size of Western Europe, and to call it free. And yet, no secret is safe forever, because Allah is the all-aware, the one who exposes what's whispered in palaces and what's buried in archives. Every unseen word written to hide a lie is still read by the Lord who never forgets. When kings want to disguise greed, they don't speak in gold, they speak in paper. And in the late 1800s, no paper was more powerful than a file stamped "To the President of the United States." Leopold knew this. He understood that America, fresh from its own civil war, wanted to look righteous before the world. So he sent not soldiers or servants, but a file, written in the language of morality, bound in the scent of progress. Inside were promises that sounded holy. He claimed to be fighting the Arab slave trade, opening new markets, bringing education and Christianity to Africa. Every word seemed soaked in virtue, but each page hid numbers, plans, and contracts for rubber, ivory, and control. To deliver the message, Leopold used intermediaries, diplomats and lobbyists who knew exactly how to decorate greed with grace. They met senators in hotels, dined with ambassadors, and spoke about civilization. In truth, they were handing over a script, a narrative the world would recite for years. That Congo was a humanitarian mission, not a kingdom of chains. The president read the file and approved. No investigation, no cost, no risk. Only the promise of shared influence in a continent rich with God's earth. And so, the first foreign power to recognize the Congo Free State was the one that called itself the Land of Liberty. Every empire has its salesman, and Leopold's was an American. His name was Henry I Kowalski, a lawyer from California with a talent for charm and corruption alike. Leopold didn't need an army in Washington. He needed a voice that could turn exploitation into philanthropy. Kowalski became that voice, dining with senators, laughing with journalists, and painting Congo as a land rescued by Christian mercy. Behind his smooth talk were prepared statements, pre-written articles, and forged reports of progress. He told Americans that Leopold was ending the slave trade and building schools, while the force publique was burning villages and cutting off hands for rubber. For every story of salvation he sold, another Congolese family disappeared into the jungle. Yet Leopold rewarded him handsomely, not for truth, but for the ability to dress evil in elegance. Kowalski's work proved something eternal, that words can kill as effectively as weapons, and propaganda is the velvet glove that hides the iron fist. But the lie would not last forever, because every pen that writes for greed eventually drips with guilt, and they know not that Allah is the holder of truth. Long before the Congo was carved, the paper bridges between Belgium and Britain were already laid. King Leopold I, the father, was not only Belgium's founder, he was Queen Victoria's uncle and confidant. Their families shared blood, language, and private correspondence, letters that rarely spoke of love, but often of strategy. These weren't the fiery declarations of revolutionaries. They were the quiet calculations of monarchs who understood that the world moved by marriage, money, and moral appearance. Through those letters, Britain and Belgium built a polite alliance, rooted not in armies, but in trust. When Victoria wrote of Britain's duty to civilize, Leopold I nodded in agreement. He taught his son that every empire begins with friendship and ends in ownership. So by the time Leopold II grew up, the path was already open. He didn't have to break doors. His father's pen had already unlocked them. The British court would see the young king not as an intruder, but as family. And when he later wrote of Christian missions and free trade, the same royal circle that had once shared ideals with his father would receive his words with trust, not suspicion. It was a perfect inheritance, not of gold, but of credibility. A spiritual irony. While Europe preached salvation, its monarchs were exchanging letters that prepared the next generation to profit from souls. By the time Leopold II came to power, the ink between Belgium and Britain was already dry from a generation before. He wrote to Queen Victoria not as a stranger, but as kin, a relative within the same Saxe-Coburg family circle that had long exchanged secrets behind polished courtesies. Their letters spoke of family births and royal ceremonies, but beneath those pleasantries lived another conversation, one of empire. Victoria, balancing Britain's global influence, understood the language of ambition. Leopold, eager to expand his reach, used that familiarity as a quiet door into credibility. Within those exchanges, he hinted at his plans for Africa. Words like civilization, commerce, and moral duty wrapped his greed in a veil of light. He wrote of free trade and humanitarian work, presenting himself as a man burdened with the mission to uplift the dark continent. Victoria's replies, though cautious, carried the tone of approval. She valued order, reputation, and Christian progress. Behind those polite courtesies, the groundwork was being laid for Britain's quiet acceptance of Leopold's future claims. No document signed it outright, but the understanding was clear. As long as trade flowed and the empire's balance was undisturbed, Britain would not stand in his way. Thus, through letters scented with royal ink and sealed with familial trust, Leopold II secured the silence he needed. It was diplomacy disguised as kinship, a family correspondence that paved the road to a human tragedy. In the winter of 1884, European powers gathered in Berlin, not to pray or cure the sickness in their nation's souls, but to divide the earth that Allah created, where every soul was meant to live free. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the host of the gathering, was no ordinary man. He was the Chancellor of Germany and one of the most powerful political architects of the 19th century. Known as the Iron Chancellor, he was the mastermind who united dozens of independent German states into a single empire in 1871, shaping the balance of power in Europe for generations. Bismarck ruled with strategy rather than sentiment. He believed in realpolitik, politics driven by reality and interest, not idealism, and mastered the art of diplomacy to keep Europe stable while advancing German power. He hosted the conference like a master of ceremonies, his table covered not in food, but in maps. Around him sat men from every imperial capital: France, Britain, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, even the distant United States. All invited to a feast of land that wasn't theirs. No African voice was called into the room. No prayer was said for the people they were about to erase. The conference was not a discussion. It was a quiet agreement that the earth, her rivers, and her souls could be traded like ivory and gold. For 3 months, from November 1884 to February 1885, they drew lines on maps as if they were gods with ink. Each stroke created a wound that would bleed for centuries. Leopold II sat in that silence as the smallest ruler with the largest ambition. And somehow, by flattery, deceit, and divine allowance, he would walk away with a kingdom the size of Western Europe. Because what they called diplomacy, Allah called a test. At Bismarck's invitation, 14 flags gathered beneath one roof, each representing a nation that saw Africa not as sacred land, but as profit waiting to be measured. Germany, France, Britain, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Austria-Hungary, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and the United States. Not a single black man with intellect was brought to that table. And worst of all, among them sat the Ottoman Empire, an empire that once thrived under Islam, that had risen with the Quran as its lifeline and held black soldiers with honor in its ranks. Yet there they sat, shoulder to shoulder with those who went against everything Allah's book had taught: justice, unity, and mercy. What began as the meeting of nations became the betrayal of faith. Across that table, maps unfolded like scripture rewritten by men. Every stroke of a pen turned villages into borders, rivers into boundaries, and people into property. They called it diplomacy, but what truly gathered that day was greed, dressed in the language of civilization. Each delegate believed himself an architect of progress, but Allah saw them as builders of arrogance, crafting borders that would outlive their empires and haunt their descendants. Because you can divide land with ink, but not the souls that belong to it. What followed in that room was not a conversation, but an auction of God's creation. Each nation, dressed in silk and pride, reached for what they thought would make them eternal. Germany walked away with the illusion of empire, its young crown hungry for respect. France gathered land across the West, chasing the ghost of its old glory. Britain secured its sea routes and trade, choosing commerce over conscience. Belgium gained a kingdom for one man's greed. Portugal clung to its dying colonies like a man holding on to his past. Spain took scraps, still haunted by the memory of its fallen empire. Italy, late to the race, reached for reputation more than resources. The Netherlands asked for nothing but trade rights, profits without people. The United States stood as the distant witness, the moral spectator who recognized Leopold's Congo first, then quietly bought what its silence allowed. And the Ottoman Empire, once raised by revelation, left the room with none. When I said they left the room with none, I didn't mean it lightly. The Ottomans didn't gain land. They gained a stain. They walked out with the weight of a guilty conscience and a mark in history that showed just how far they had drifted from their divine purpose, the duty Allah once gave them to protect the oppressed. By 1884, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the force it had been. It was weak, fragmented, and desperate to remain relevant among the European powers. But in that desperation, they forgot who they were. They no longer ruled by the Quran as they once did during their golden centuries. Instead of standing for justice or defending their African Muslim brothers, they sat quietly while the land Allah made sacred was divided by men who denied Him. That silence was their downfall, not the loss of land, but the loss of their soul. What the Europeans divided in a couple of hours would take Africa centuries to heal from. They tore through bloodlines, languages, and lands, rewriting destinies that were never theirs to touch. They called it progress, but Allah recorded it as oppression. They called it civilization, but what they truly built was a curse, one that would echo through generations, carried by the cries of mothers, the silence of stolen children, and the memory of a continent that once breathed in unity. And when their maps were finally folded and their ink had dried, the heavens still watched. For the one who created this earth never signed his name on their borders. Not a single black man or woman sat down and signed their people's rights away. Yet their fates were rewritten. In the span of a few hours, entire civilizations were renamed, rebranded, and rearranged as if their souls were property. Borders were drawn with rulers and arrogance, slicing through tribes, tongues, and histories that had lived in harmony for centuries. Africa did not lose land. She was dissected. Nations became fragments, families became foreigners, and the earth itself was forced to forget her name. The merchants called it progress, but it was possession. The kings called it order, but it was desecration. The entire earth witnessed the souls it once cradled and nourished be scattered across the seas. Even the trees grieved, their roots aching to move, to reach out and shelter the children being taken, yet bound to the soil by Allah's command. The winds carried the cries, the rivers mirrored the sorrow, and the mountains stood in silence as witnesses. For every treaty signed in Berlin, a covenant was broken in heaven, because Allah never permitted the sale of what He created sacred. And though they divided the body of Africa, they could never divide the soul of her people. Because every river still runs with memory, and every child born beneath her sky still carries the rhythm of what was stolen.